Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today, I am bringing you a pretty crazy version of the Tal Rasha Meteor build, which is fantastic for speed GRs. With fairly decent gear, you can easily mow through GR 120s in less than 2 minutes. Sometimes you'll go a little bit above the 2-minute mark. It's a little bit dependent on how nice the map is, especially with regards to teleport. When you run into those maps where there's a lot of terrain that you can get stuck on, it can become slightly frustrating, but overall you should always be able to clear GR 120s in less than 3 minutes. Now this build is centered around the In Geom, so we are playing an elite hunting build. If that's not necessarily your style, this may not be the build for you, but I would encourage you to watch until the end because we have so much incentive this season to elite hunt. Let's start with the skills. First, we've got Diamond Skin with Prism to reduce the arcane power cost by 9 of all of our skills while Diamond Skin is active. This also gives us a shield for those 3 seconds that will absorb up to 40% of our maximum life in incoming damage. Moving on to Meteor, we're actually going to be using the Thunder Crash rune. Instead of playing Cold or Arcane, we want our meteors to come out instantly because we're trying to get through these GRs as quickly as we can. With the delay on Star Pact and Comet, it makes things a little bit too slow to get through rifts incredibly fast. But one thing that I will note is that we are going to be throwing out a lot of meteors of all different elements, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll also be using Explosive Blast with Chain Reaction. We are using the Orb of Infinite Depth in this build, and so the synergy between these two skills is incredible. We're going to be gaining 80% damage reduction and 40% increased damage as long as we're keeping this at 4 stacks. We'll be using Teleport with Calamity. This is going to deal arcane damage to enemies that are in our area when we teleport in. This is to make sure that we can get all 4 stacks on our Tal Rasha set. This rune also pairs incredibly well with the In Geom while we have that buff up and we can be teleporting everywhere. Each time we teleport into an enemy, we are going to proc an arcane meteor to come down. Next up, we'll be using Ice Armor with Frozen Storm. This is really nice because it's going to surround us in a barrier of ice that's constantly hitting enemies around us, which will proc cold meteors to come down. Lastly, for the skills, we're going to be using Familiar with Spark Flint. This is really nice because it's 10% increased damage and is also throwing out fiery attacks so that we can proc fire meteors. As long as we're hitting Explosive Blast enough, this is also going to proc fire meteors, so we have a lot of opportunity to proc fire meteors in this build while we're constantly hitting them with this cold barrier and teleporting into them with this rune. And so what's going to happen is we're doing all of these different elements of damage, and so each time we move into an enemy, we're proccing meteors all over. To move into the passives, we are going to be using Galvanizing Ward. This is going to help to protect our Squirt's Necklace. We'll also be using Audacity because the goal of this build is to constantly be teleporting into enemies to proc meteors of all different types. While we're in range of them, we're going to get 30% increased damage. So I like to take Astral Presence mostly just to keep my arcane power up, but do note that this is a flex spot, and so if you are able to keep your arcane up, feel free to change this to whatever you'd like. Lastly, for the passives, we're going to be using Elemental Exposure. This is going to be up just about all the time because we are using all 4 different elements. Effectively, this is just going to give us 20% increased damage overall. Alright, moving on to the gear, we are of course going to be using the Tal Rasha set, and to start with the helm, you're going to want Int, Crit, Meteor Damage, and a socket. You're also going to want to take a diamond in this build as opposed to the topaz that you use in the pushing variant. The pushing variation of Tal Rasha does not really need any cooldown reduction, but we are reliant on it for things like our Explosive Blast and our Diamond Skin, and we also just want to be able to teleport as much as possible so that we can get from elite to elite. We're also going to be using Oghilds in this build. These are the stats that I would recommend that you take: Intelligence, area damage, cooldown, resource cost reduction. Next up, we're using the Squirt's Necklace, and mine is terrible, so I really hope that you have a better one. Ideally, you're going to want to have cold damage, crit hit, crit chance, and a socket. And for the legendary gem, I would recommend taking Bane of the Powerful. Moving on to the gloves, we will be using Tal Rasha's. Intelligence is okay, but ideally you could get resource cost reduction here. You will want the crit chance, crit damage, and cooldown percent. For the chest piece, we will also be using Tal Rasha's Intelligence, Vitality, Attack Speed, ideally getting that 7% attack speed. I only rolled 5, and Armor are going to work just fine. So for the bracers, we will be using Oghilds so that we can benefit from that 3-piece set. We do have a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube, so you are going to want that cold damage, intelligence, vitality, and crit hit chance. We'll also be using the Tal Rasha's belt. I would recommend the intelligence, vitality, As opposed to all resist, it would be much better to get armor, because as an intelligence class, we naturally get all resist just by getting more intelligence. Lastly, you'll want to take that 15% life as well. So moving on to the reason why I'm stacking cold damage, feel free to stack any elemental damage that you'd like. Just make sure that it is all the same type, so you're building it up as much as possible. The Stone of Jordan is going to make sure that our highest elemental damage roll applies to all of our elements. So for this ring, you're going to want to take whatever element that you're stacking. I'm using cold. You're going to want to take that damage against elites. Make sure you get a socket. Ideally, if possible, you'd like to get crit hit damage over that intelligence. And for the legendary gem, I would recommend going with Molten Wildebeest Gizzard. This is going to ensure that our Squirt's necklace stays up. We're stacking a lot of shields on this build so that we can keep that 100% damage bonus up as much as possible. We'll also be using the convention of elements. You're going to want that intelligence, crit chance, crit damage, and a socket. I do recommend taking Bane of the Trapped. I will note that when it comes to the intelligence roll, feel free to roll that off if you need additional cooldown or any other stat to kind of round out your build. For the legs, we will be using Tal Rasha's intelligence, vitality, armor, 2 sockets, and I do recommend topaz. And of course for the boots, we'll be using Nilfr's boast. This gives us incredible meteor damage. I do recommend really focusing on that secondary roll, making sure that it gets as close to 900 as possible. It has a really wide range from 675 to 900, so really focus on getting a better secondary roll. These will be the stats that you want as well: the intelligence, vitality, armor, and meteor damage. As I had mentioned earlier, for the weapon, we will be using In Geom. 10% damage, cooldown, socket, all very good. The intelligence can be rolled off for something else like area damage or resource cost reduction. I will note that if you are a lower Paragon, you'll probably get a little more value from that intelligence. If you're a higher Paragon level, you may want to consider rolling it off for something else. As we had mentioned earlier, we're also going to be going with the Orb of Infinite Depth. Mine is not rolled perfectly, and it's kind of a difficult piece to roll correctly. Of course, you'll want the average damage, the intelligence is good, crit chance is good. You absolutely need 4 arcane power on crit. Make sure that you're also focusing on that secondary roll, because if you only roll 8%, considering that this stacks up to 4 times, you're actually going to be losing 8% damage if you don't get a perfect 10% roll. And the last thing that I will note is that the vitality is not the correct stat here. Ideally, you would want to get 15% meteor damage. The craziest thing about this build is that my gear is really suboptimal, especially if we look at my Squirt's necklace, missing the cold damage, really low crit damage. On top of that, I'm missing meteor damage from the Orb of Infinite Depth. Despite all this, it's still incredibly easy to get sub 3-minute GR 120s. I would imagine that when I get some more Paragon, get a better Squirts, a better Orb of Infinite Depth, I may even be able to start speedrunning up to 125. Maybe if you're good enough, you can even run 130s with this build. I don't really think that it is capable of speed farming much higher than that. That may be the absolute top end, but speed farming GR 120 is still really good at Paragon 2400. So in the cube, the Grand Vizier is absolutely essential. This is going to reduce the resource cost of Meteor by 50% and also give it an additional 400% damage. Next up is the Mempo of Twilight. This is absolutely essential as well. The Meteor Shower rune is now applied, and it deals 400% increased damage. These 2 items in the cube are absolutely essential. The build will not function without them. So if you're building up towards this build, don't get discouraged if your character feels weak before you've got your cube finished out and all of the items that you need. And of course, because we are using the Oghild set and only 5 pieces of the Tal Rasha set, we're going to be needing a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube. So moving on to the follower, I recommend taking the Enchantress, primarily because she's giving us cooldown reduction. Mine is not exactly a perfect example of the Enchantress. I am missing the Gloves of Worship here, which are incredibly important this season because our potion gives us shrine effects. You're also going to want to make sure that your follower has at least 25,000 intelligence so that you get the max benefit from all of these skills down here. But the essential pieces include the Flavor of Time, the Nemesis Bracers, the Oculus Ring, the Gloves of Worship that I don't have, and I really like Creed's Flame for this build. Now this is absolutely not essential, but every once in a while we start to have resource problems, and this really helps us. Each time that we take fire damage, we are restoring arcane power. This is kind of just a nice little quality of life pick to make sure that we're not running into many inconvenient situations where we're starved for resources. And lastly, unless you've completely decked out your follower in fantastic gear that's augmented, that's going to keep them alive, I would recommend taking the Smoking Thurible so that they cannot die. Now, before we go into the gameplay, I do want to go over a few pros and cons for this build. I will note that it has a lot more pros than cons, so let's go ahead and dive into those real quick. So the first pro is that this build actually does quite well even when In Geom is not up. This build is still really functional and able to clear out a lot of trash when you don't have all of those cooldowns instantly resetting. The next pro is that this build synergizes with the Altar of Rites incredibly well. Right here, we've got 15% increased damage against elites, 20% more here, 25% damage reduction from elites as well. On top of that, we've also got the Reaper ability here where elite packs drop 1 additional progress orb. Now you do have to kill the entire pack, so if you see one of those yellow enemies and they've got the silver bordered enemies around them, you're gonna have to kill all of the silver bordered enemies to make sure that you get that progress orb. This is also required for In Geom. If you're not killing all of the elites in a pack, you're not gonna get the effect. For the final pros, I will note that it's a really fast build, it's really fun, it's easy to play, and you're incredibly tanky. In fact, it's so tanky that you can basically stand inside of explosions, and sometimes you won't even lose all of your shields and you'll continue to keep your squirts up. If you don't like paying attention much and you're kind of just looking for a speed farming build to destroy everything, this is absolutely the one. It is so difficult to die, and it's really quick at clearing content. To dive into the cons, I will note that teleport can be a little bit frustrating at times. It's really easy to get caught inside of some terrain, and while you're trying to teleport from place to place, you can constantly get stuck and kind of unable to go through. Now the next one is kind of a mix between a pro and a con. We have incredible damage reduction with our Orb of Infinite Depth, but we have to keep up our 4 stacks of Explosive Blast. So you're going to have to constantly be hitting this skill and making sure that you're standing in a close proximity to enemies so that you're keeping those stacks up. Effectively, even though we're using 2 passive skills between the Ice Armor and the Familiar, this build does require quite a lot of button management. You're going to be teleporting everywhere, casting Explosive Blast all the time, casting Diamond Skin basically whenever you can just to save that arcane power, and you're also going to be casting down meteors on enemies. So it's a lot of buttons in quick succession. Okay, so to dive into how you're going to want to play this build, the first thing you're going to want to do is activate your passives. Once those are up, you're effectively going to want to find an elite as soon as possible and kill them to proc your In Geom. Make sure that you're spamming Explosive Blast as much as possible, and when you're about to cast all of your meteors, get that Diamond Skin up to save some arcane power. If you want to play this build a little easier, you can basically just spam Diamond Skin all the time and just kind of get the savings of the arcane power whenever it's up. Alright, so once you've killed the first pack of elites, you're going to want to teleport as quickly as you can to find the next pack of elites. On the way, it's okay to kill a little bit of trash, but generally you're going to want to stay focused on going from elite to elite so that your In Geom is up all the time. Do bear in mind that some trash is going to naturally die along the way. Each time you teleport onto them, you're proccing meteors of all sorts of different elements that are going to come down on them while you continue to move to the next elite. And that's effectively it. You're just going from elite to elite and destroying everything. Teleport as much as you can. It's okay to throw in a few meteors as well, but every time you teleport onto an enemy, you're going to proc Arcane, then the Cold is going to proc, then the Explosive Blast or the Spark Flint is going to shoot, and you're going to constantly be hitting them with different elements and proccing all sorts of different meteors. This is incredible with the Stone of Jordan. Personally, I've never played a build that actually benefits more from the Stone of Jordan than this build does. Because we are using all 4 different elements, it's incredible that we're able to stack up this much elemental damage for each one. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and tack on a quick GR120 run that I just did to the end of this video. Hope that you guys enjoyed the guide. Go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know if you've tried this build out, if you like it. Let me know if you tried the Aether Walker variant, and if you'd like a build guide for that. As always, guys, I genuinely appreciate you for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.